This will be the last video on Thesis 1. By now we should have an understanding of the deficiencies that Marx observes in both materialism and idealism, particularly with respect to the way in which each of these positions precludes some essential aspect of the kind of philosophy that Marx wants to develop. Marx wants a revolutionary philosophy, a philosophy that can change things in the world. And to do that, Marx needs there to be an active side to reality. As we saw earlier in this series, materialism doesn't allow for such a concept to emerge. Idealism does allow for a concept of an active side to emerge, but that active side is not something that Marx is really excited about. Because in idealism, the active side is something mental or spiritual. In the Hegelian system, specifically, it's Geist, which is translated as spirit or mind. The Geist in Hegel's system, or something spiritual or mental in other variants of idealism that preceded Hegel, in all of these cases, the active side is not, as Marx would like it to be, the activity of human beings. Then along comes Ludwig Feuerbach, who we looked at in the last video. And Feuerbach comes really close to developing a philosophy that Marx can get behind. Feuerbach takes the power away from the Geist, since he is inverting Hegel's philosophy specifically, and places that power in the hands of human beings. Or perhaps I shouldn't say the hands of human beings. Maybe I should say the heads. Because the kind of activity that Feuerbach is interested in is pretty much confined to contemplation, to contemplative activity, thinking. Not necessarily to action, as Marx would like it, that is, sensuous activity. So although Feuerbach does develop a philosophy which seems to allow for an active side to emerge, which is the activity of human beings, that activity of human beings is not sensuous activity. And so with materialism, idealism, and now Feuerbach, who up until this point Marx had really looked up to, along with a lot of other German philosophers at that time, with all of these philosophies and individual philosophers not being able to allow for the emergence of an active side which just is the sensuous activity of people, Marx is kind of on his own here. And this is what makes this such an interesting document to look at, particularly from a history of philosophy perspective. Because Marx is not only on his own in the sense that he is developing something new, he is going up against giants of philosophy. And he has only just graduated university himself, remember. Marx is also in political exile. So he's in political exile when he's writing the theses on Feuerbach, and he's also in a kind of intellectual exile. He's left behind Feuerbach, he's left behind Hegel, who a few years earlier he initially had a strong attraction towards, like a lot of other philosophers at that time. And he's abandons the young Hegelians, the leftist materialist philosophers who want to rework Hegel's system into a materialist philosophy, into an atheistic philosophy, and ultimately into a political philosophy, a philosophy that can be practiced. And that's exactly why Marx drops his... the young Hegelians were not exactly an official group, but Marx drops his quote-unquote membership in the group, precisely because he's come to view their philosophical activity as overshadowing the practical work that is necessary to develop revolutionary philosophy, world-changing philosophy. Last time we looked at the way Feuerbach inverted Hegel's philosophy and why that was significant. We looked at why Feuerbach's criticism of Hegel is different from that of Marx's, and why ultimately Marx feels Feuerbach didn't secure a properly materialist alternative to the Hegelian philosophy. More importantly, from the perspective of trying to understand the kind of philosophy Marx himself is working to develop, we looked at why Feuerbach's criticism of Hegel, his inversion of Hegel, still doesn't allow for the specific kind of active side that Marx needs to develop his revolutionary philosophy. It's because the activity that Feuerbach's philosophy allows for as the active side is not that of sensuous activity, but rather of contemplative activity. In this video, we'll continue with that line of thought, focusing more specifically on the distinction between Feuerbach's contemplative activity and what Marx calls practical critical activity, what is very often referred to by Marxists and Marxist scholars as something called praxis. And we'll take a little bit of a look at what that word means, sort of the history of how that word has come to be used in Marxist writings, and we'll try and trace the development of that idea from, it's a very old idea in the history of philosophy. We'll try to trace its development up to Marx, and I really want to look at how Marx takes that idea, which is a classical idea in philosophy, and look at how Marx contributes to philosophy going forward with his use of that word. What we're going to see here is Marx expanding on the claim that we took a look at in the last video, the claim that Feuerbach does not consider human sensuous activity as the active side of reality. If not our sensuous activity, as Marx would like it, then what is it for Feuerbach? Well, for Feuerbach, it's all about our contemplative activity, our thinking. So in the last couple of lines of Thesis 1, we're going to find Marx describing exactly how Feuerbach mistakenly privileges the contemplative attitude or theoretical attitude over and above our sensuous activity. He privileges our capacity to think over and above our capacity to act. And that's a big problem for Marx. In these last couple of lines, Marx writes that Feuerbach conceives of the theoretical attitude as the only genuinely human attitude, and he specifically mentions Feuerbach's most well-known work, The Essence of Christianity. If you'll recall in part 1 of the videos on the first thesis, we actually took a look at a section of text from this work, The Essence of Christianity. Pretty big block of text we looked at alongside a passage from Marx's own German ideology, and we looked at these alongside one another to get an understanding of how each of these philosophers understands the distinction between human beings and animals. And if you'll recall, as we saw in that first video, for Feuerbach, the distinction between human beings and animals has to do with our capacity for self-awareness, whereas for Marx, the distinction has to do with our human beings, our capacity to produce our own means of subsistence. And so for Feuerbach, self-awareness, something to do with thinking, something about the way that we think, something cognitive, distinguishes us from animals, whereas for Marx it has to do with something that we do, has to do with the way that we act. So we start to see this distinction between the emphasis being placed on thinking versus the emphasis being placed on acting. Why this is important and becoming increasingly important at this point especially is the way philosophy works is you build off of your more basic assumptions. The end point of a philosophical system or theory is going to rest on previous and more basic assumptions that a philosopher's already established. So if we're establishing our distinction between human beings and animals, what we are in effect saying is this is what makes a human being a human being. If we say it has something to do with our thinking, something to do with the way we cognize things, something to do with our mind, rather than our physical, concrete, sensuous activities, we're making a very clear statement about what we think is important for human beings to do. Thinking is an activity, of course, but when I say that Marx is emphasizing acting, he's obviously emphasizing corporeal or sensuous activity, whereas Feuerbach emphasizes theoretical or cognitive activity. And Marx and Feuerbach are both critical philosophers. So if you want your philosophy to center around thinking, and you're a critical philosopher, meaning a philosopher critiquing society in particular, then what you're going to end up with is a philosophy that advocates for more thinking. We will solve social problems by changing our ideas, by changing the way we think. And this is where Feuerbach falls back onto idealism. Now then, does this mean that if Marx is disappointed in Feuerbach's emphasis on thinking, on the theoretical activities, on the contemplative activities, does this mean that Marx is only interested in sensuous activity? Does this mean that he is not interested at all in theory or contemplation or thinking? Not at all. Remember that Marx really tries to avoid one-sidedness in philosophy. So it's not that Marx wants to privilege sensuous activity over theoretical activity. He wants both. In fact, he needs both to do a revolutionary philosophy. What Marx needs is practical critical activity. So practical critical activity, as the hyphen signifies, is a fusion of two distinct kinds of activity. The theory, on the one hand, the critical, and putting that theory into practice on the other, the practical. Now, I personally like the phrase practical critical activity because I think it encompasses a really distinct and interesting aspect of Marx as a philosopher. Like I said, he likes to avoid any kind of one-sidedness, any kind of imbalance in philosophical thought, and practical critical activity signifies as a fusion of both theory and practice. But it's, for whatever reason, certainly not as commonly used by Marxist writers themselves, not nearly as commonly used as the word praxis, which essentially signifies the practical critical activity that we're discussing. Praxis comes from the Greek, means an activity or a practice, and there are a lot of philosophers throughout the history of philosophy that have either used this word or have either used an idea that is comparable to the idea signified by the word. I've picked out a couple that I'm drawing from the dictionary of, what is it called? The Dictionary of Marxist Terms, or the Dictionary of Marxist something. I'll put the link to that in the description, and the author of that chapter in the description. I picked out a couple that I thought were apropos for what we're trying to uncover here in Marxist thought. We can go back at least as far as Aristotle. We could go back even a little bit further, but we'll stick to Aristotle. Aristotle conceived of two kinds of activity for human beings to partake in. These were theoretical and practical. So there's a fission, not a fusion. They're two different activities. You can be doing theory or you can be doing practice. Note that Marx combines these two, combines the theory and practice in practical critical activity. Francis Bacon, another philosopher who we'll probably revisit in, I think, Thesis 2, we'll end up probably revisiting this idea, which is that theory proves its truth in practice. Basically, Bacon thinks that you want to know if this theory works? Try it out. Marx says something a little bit more sophisticated than the paraphrase I've just offered in Thesis 2, which is why I say we'll probably return to that idea later. But really where I think the phrase praxis enters into the discourse of Marxist scholarship is with Antonio Gramsci. I'm not the only one who thinks this. You can look into this for yourself as well. Antonio Gramsci was a Marxist and a writer. He wrote some of his most important works while he was in prison. He was a political prisoner. And while he was in prison, he had a bit of a problem getting letters out of the jail, because the prison guards would read his letters, and if they saw a word like Marxism in any of his letters, they would certainly not allow them to leave the prison, or they would make him remove it, or he would probably get in a lot of trouble. So he invented kind of a code word for himself and for people that he was sending these works out to, whenever he was talking about Marxism, he would replace Marxism with the phrase, the philosophy of praxis. And this was, I guess, around 100 years ago. And since then, many people have taken up the use of this word praxis when discussing the practical critical activity that Marx advocates for. Keep in mind that Marx himself only used the word praxis once in his own writings. And even that one instance of him using the word, when it was translated into English, it was translated as practice or practical critical activity. But over time, the word praxis has come to be more popular, more commonly used. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if it's good or bad. Like I said, I prefer practical critical activity because I think it really drives home the idea that Marx is fusing two seemingly distinct ideas that would be, underscoring the dialectical quality of his philosophy. But for whatever reason, the word praxis is very, very commonly used by Marxist scholars and writers. So I thought it was pretty important at least to, at some point at least, go into a little bit of the history of this word, how it came to be used in the discourse of Marxist scholarship and Marxist thought, and explain, basically what it means. It's practical critical activity. So we're wrapping up the first thesis of the thesis on Feuerbach, which is pretty cool. I hope others are enjoying these talks. I've been enjoying making them. I hope people are finding them helpful in understanding this work. Just some final thoughts I wanted to share before we move on to Thesis 2 is, if you'll recall in the there was a kind of a series overview video that's at the beginning of this playlist. And one of the things that I talked about in there was that I think the Thesis on Feuerbach holds not just valuable insights for those interested in Marxist philosophy specifically, but also some valuable insights for those interested in the study of philosophy in general. I think Marx, at this stage of his career, when he is in his arguably more philosophical period of his work, I think that this document holds some interesting challenges to philosophers. Obviously, the most famous of which is the 11th thesis, which we'll get to eventually, where Marx says that philosophers have only analyzed the world, the task is to change it. We're already seeing the seeds of that idea in these last couple of lines of Thesis 1, where Marx advocates for practical critical activity over mere theory, mere contemplation.